Good to be back again with all of you. We want to continue on with our study through this interesting passage in chapter 12 of the book of Romans, taking on some of the, I think, sometimes confusing and misunderstood and sometimes even complex words that we find in this passage that I think unless we understand them well, we stand a really good chance of really missing the heart of what the Apostle Paul is trying to communicate in this letter, at least the best that we can 2,000 years after it was written. And so part of what I try to do, even for my own study, is just to take the complex and try to see if we can simplify it a little bit, at least for our benefit. Let's look again at Romans, the 12th chapter and the first verse. It says this: "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship." Now, I'm reading out of the New American Standard today because I think it adds to our understanding of what I think the Apostle Paul is trying to say here. You know, today the word worship is a I don't know, in many ways, it's kind of like a hot button word for us. And I think one of the places that we can go to understand at least a little bit more about the word itself is in the book of John, where Jesus and the Samaritan woman meet at a place called Jacob's Well. We read about it in chapter 4 of John's Gospel, and by way of background, I think it's helpful to understand at least a little bit about the setting. Samaria is a territory in ancient Israel where certain tribes of Jewish people settled, and the enemy, the Assyrians, conquered Samaria, and the Assyrians resettled foreigners in this area called Samaria. And over time, the Samaritan people became sort of a second-class set of Jewish people. Over time, they became mixed race and mixed cultures. And what we find in this 4th chapter of John is that they had a mixed way of worshiping, the Jews on one hand and the Samaritans on the other. Have you ever visited a church? And when you went in as kind of an outsider, they did things really differently than what you were used to? You ever had that experience? I think back as I was preparing this week, kind of remembering years ago, I did a study with a group of college-age young people where we were looking at different religious groups and different, both Christian and non-Christian, and trying to understand who they were and what they taught and how they worshiped. And one of the things that we did is that we would take kind of random nights and we would go and we would visit different kinds of groups. And I remember we went to Jehovah's Witness, and we went to Mormon gatherings, and we went to a Jewish tabernacle to worship with them. And one time we went, and I remember we went on a Saturday night, and we went and visited a Unitarian Universalist church. Oh my goodness, it was so so different than anything any of us had ever experienced. And even at the end of their service, the leader got up in front and said, well, this concludes the main part of our service, but we would like any of you who are here, if you would like to join us and come in this back room where we will begin calling on the dead. Oh gosh, you should have seen it. Half of my group was there and they went, we're out of here. And then there was another half of our group that hopped right up and got in line to go back behind the closed door to see what it was that they were going to do. Oh, it was a crazy night. And we learned that not everybody even there in their Unitarian Universalist kind of church knew what they were doing. Back in the setting of Jesus and the Samaritan woman, Samaria is where King Ahab built a temple to the pagan deity Baal for people to worship in. The Samaritans had their pagan gods, and the Jews accused them of idolatry and straying away from the one true God. The Samaritans believed their worship, true worship, was to be conducted on a mountain in their region rather than down in Jerusalem. So when we read of Jesus' discussion with the Samaritan woman over where real worship was to take place, she had some pretty strong feelings about the location. Now you can check it out in all of John chapter 4, but here's the part where we're going to pick it up at in verses 21 to 23. It says this, "A time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem." Jesus says that to her and any who happened to be listening there. Real worship was not going to take place in either one of those places. He goes on to say, "You Samaritans, you worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews." And then in verse 23, "Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks." Look, there has always been confusion over worship, back in Jesus' day all the way up to now. There's disagreement over what the word itself even means. There are multiple words that are translated worship in the Bible. There's disagreement over how worship is to be practiced. Disagreement over what's proper and what's right. For the Samaritan woman with Jesus, worship to her was about a location, the mountain. In the group setting, for some, worship is a really emotionally moving thing. Even in our current church culture, we still use the terminology mountaintop experience to refer to an exhilarating spiritual moment that we might have. And even if for some it is very emotional, to others worship can be very cerebral, even stoic. These days that we live in, and certainly throughout the course of my own lifetime, Worship is generally defined by the religious heritage you come from or you happen to stumble into. The church that I grew up in honestly didn't teach much about worship. But I think it inferred a lot. There were just a lot of assumptions made about this thing that was often referred to as worship. I think in my upbringing, probably similar to a lot of yours, the Sunday morning worship service is what we called it. That Sunday morning gathering, I think for me at least, and I would imagine for you likewise, that framework for what I believed to be worship to be all about, I carried that same framework that I learned in that Sunday morning service. I carried that into my college years, into my young adult years, even into my early years as a minister on a church staff. Now, I'll tell you, after all of these years, some things have certainly changed. But much of that baggage that I had in my life is still around. Maybe not so much in mine, but certainly in the people that I'm around. And there are what I see today, there are hundreds of years of baggage, or 50 years, or even 10 years that we carry with us into our moments of worship right now that inform what we do. These days, for so many church people of all stripes and of all tribes, worship is almost always synonymous with singing. It's connected to a band or a worship leader or singing worship songs or referring to this now, let's enter into a time of worship, which is almost always connected to music in some way. Or maybe it's simply a section of a church program that we participate in. But I want to tell you here today that worship, at least when we look at the Word and we follow it along in Scripture, it is so very much more than singing. So what is worship really? Well, Bible dictionaries and theological books give definitions something like this. Worship is when we give our deepest affections and highest praise to something. True worship of God is when we are in this space where we are loving God with our whole heart and our whole soul and our mind and our strength. All of us is wrapped up in offering this praise to God. It's when we prize God above everything else and put Him first in our hearts and in our minds in that moment. I wholeheartedly agree with that as a definition. But I think this verse that we've been studying in Romans chapter 12, verse 1, I think it gives us an even deeper understanding of the concept of worship. Look at it again. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. I love this. I love that translation of our New Testament. Worship is simply the appropriate response to the grace and mercy that God has extended to us. Worship is a response. Do you see it? Did you see it in the verse that we just read? Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. Worship is an offering that we give. It is something that we give to God. It is where we present our bodies as a living sacrifice to God. It is when we say, "Here, God, this is what I'm giving to you." This short sentence that we have been reading over the past few weeks, it helps us understand what worship is. I want you to check it out in 3 or 4 different translations that can maybe help us grasp the idea that worship is a response that we make. That's how we begin the definition. You can look at it here and kind of follow along. In the New International Version, which is the one that we've been reading, says this: "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God." This is your true and proper worship. When I see your mercy extended to me in moments, in seasons, in the everyday part of my life, when I recognize your mercy or your grace being given to me, my response to that is that I offer to you my body as true and proper worship. This is how I've always taught children about worship all throughout my life. We love the things that we receive from God. With children, it's really fun to do that because you can ask them the question and go, "What are some things that God has given you?" And they can quickly rattle off things. And I'll say we absolutely love the things that we receive from God. Worship is different. Worship is the opposite of receiving. Worship is giving back to God. It is giving myself to Him in the moments of my day. The New American Standard, which we read earlier, says, "Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship." God, I see your mercy given to me, and my response, my worship, is to present my body back to you as spiritual service. Or a more modern translation, the New Living Translation, says, "And so, dear brothers, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all He has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind He will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship Him. Because of everything that God has done for me, I give my body as a true way to worship Him." Maybe the best and most insightful translation of this text for me is found in The Message by Eugene Peterson. Check this out. This is the whole text. "Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for Him." So here's what I want you to do. God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, You're sleeping, you're eating, going to work, and walking around life. And you go this week and place it before God as an offering. You give that to Him. The way that I would see Eugene Peterson saying this is, as I see God helping me live out my ordinary day, the things that go on in my day, sleeping and eating and working and interacting with other people, I take all of that and I place it before God as an offering. Even the normal, even the mundane, all of it given back to Him. And that is both an emotional and a cerebral response back to God. So as you go about your business of living this week, I want you to remember these words. May every interaction, every decision, every step, every breath, may all of it be placed before God as an offering of worship. Think it through. Feel it deeply. Look back at the mercies of God and give to God what He deserves. You know, the bread and juice of communion that we share each week, this is a physical act of worship. When we remember the mercies of God revealed in the death of Jesus on the cross, we take these to tangibly touch the very things that have given us new life. When we eat and drink, we are restating the agreement we have made with God that we will continually offer our own bodies back to Him in worship, back to others in loving service, as we follow the example of Jesus, who has given His life on our behalf. Till next time, see ya.